Actually did it officially. Got it. All right, so this is officially meeting 3 of our stakeholders and April 24th. And we got about 2 hours. First part of the meeting is really making sure you know what topics we're answering, and essentially it's a lot of the discussion we didn't have last time. But we're talking about a very single individual piece, which was mitigation fees. This is more about all the other topics that we didn't hit. In addition, we're going to hit where we are in the process, and then also remind ourselves about the role of the mitigation program overall compared to the rest of the housing components. We'll also spend a little bit of time just very quickly on what we said last time. You provided some good direction last time, even though it was hard. You provide some good direction, but we'll remind you what that is. And then we're going to spend most of the time running through all these other topics, including revisiting through some different questions, mitigation fee levels in terms of units as a way to look at also fees in addition to units. So we've got most of the time doing exercises and having discussion. So we jump forward. You should have you should have received a packet also responding to some of your questions last time. We're not going to open that packet up right now, but I think it will come out through conversation and we can definitely hit those topics. But it was in direct response to having more data, or at least maybe in some cases a wider breadth or a bigger look at the program overall. So jumping right into the structure, just topics to think of as we get into it. We'll be talking about median family income categories and what range is the mitigation program do we want it to hit, and we'll be addressing that. We'll talk a little bit about the great change of use. What happens if a business changes its use in terms of intensity? Do they have to change their mitigation? Housing credits, who gets credits and who doesn't, and should that be adjusted? And then also talk a little bit about exemptions, who's by size of home as well as key institutional buildings, should that be adjusted? And then anything else. These are all things that are important in terms of the code. We'll be highlighting, the code language as we go forward, but these are the topics that we'll hit. So a little bit of where we are. Remember stakeholder, as people recall, stakeholder meeting 1. We talked a little bit about the current data, sort of the restart. And this is where our Nexus study has brought us. In meeting 2, we had updated data, but we jumped right into the hard question first of fee levels. And so I do thank everyone, Anna, Tyler, Sky, Rob, Melissa, for trying to tackle that question. I know it was a hard meeting, so I appreciate it. Not saying this meeting will be any easier, but you have one under your belt. So today we'll revisit some of our things that we talked about and then enter some new discussions and see where we get to. Just a reminder though, we understand that as we talk about these things and especially as we talk to our electeds and so on, that mitigation is only one small piece of the housing program. And so we just need to continually remind ourselves, though we're doing a deep dive on one topic, it's always within context of a larger program. And we recognize that as we have these discussions. And felt it was important to remind ourselves in that. Some of that was in your packet that was sent ahead to remind you that there's a larger program out there. I know you all know it, but it's important, again, just to remind ourselves this. All right, so what we heard. So jumping right into this, so we'll be doing a lot of the famous, this will be known as the project of slider bars, I'm sure after we're done. But a little bit of what we heard, and then we're going to revisit this slide. So I don't think we have to do a dive into this yet, because it's more towards the end of this session that we'll revisit this one again. But just initial reaction, sort of the guttural feel that you had was that currently single family mitigation could be increased to be closer to full mitigation. So above 50% mitigation, closer to that, knowing that that would be an increase. While multifamily, maybe a 50% level of mitigation makes sense because I think the discussion was, isn't that providing some workforce and local housing? While retail and restaurant, a great discussion on, do we want to make sure that we preserve opportunities for our retail or especially our restaurants? And so maybe that could go a little bit lower, while lodging could go a little bit higher. So a good discussion on mitigation fees, with most fees sort of, at least especially on the residential and the lodging, going above 50% mitigation. So remember, we'll come back to that. So we're not losing that thought. We'll have a whole other discussion on that, and we're going to do it through units this time. Order of compliance. I think this discussion was interesting and a good one, of how much do we change, in terms of order compliance. Remember, this was at the end of the meeting, so it was a lot, and that was how much do we need to adjust. Clearly the feeling was, building on site is the best. That's what the code really emphasizes. But are there some, modifications that we want to do? And the polling was a little bit here or there, but it was mainly towards that direction. But we can, I think, Wendy and Ashley, did we want to spend a little bit more time? Because I know that slide down to the bottom of right of what that could mean. We didn't talk too much about that. So did you want to elaborate on that and spend just a couple minutes talking about that?
Yeah, I'll just jump in. That's okay. Thanks, Bruce. To just to sort of recap, this slide is showing at the top on the right, kind of the initial voting that came out of our question here, which was basically asking what would encourage developers to build units rather than pay a fee, just to try to get more units built, in essence. Just FYI, the town has indicated that most units, when they are required through town development, do get built. They really only collect the fees for fractional units. Actually, and in recent years, even some of the fractional units have been getting built just because people know they need them. So the town seems to be doing a pretty good job as far as this goes. The county, mostly gets single family development. As you guys know, a lot of times that means a fractional unit. So they usually get fees, and or it's just not practical to put, a unit with a single family home. So, the county more often does get fees. That being said, this question was really just asking what we could do to incentivize more fees. Per discussion, after the voting, you can see where it landed. The bar graph on the bottom left is really how it changed after our discussion, where it was realized, oh, well, yeah, the current program, we're kind of happy with that, but we could tighten up exemptions to encourage more on-site development. And so then these statements off to the right are kind of the bigger ones that came out of our discussion, is, sort of what might those modifications be. One idea that fleshed out and that also came from some of the options was to potentially require a higher fee if the units are not built. So you mitigate at 50%, maybe your fee sits at 70% of the max, for example, have your higher fee set. The other idea that came out was, well, maybe we just require multifamily developments over a limit, say 10,000 square feet, to build their units on site. That was something else that came out of the discussion. So I guess the question is, I don't know if any of you have thought more about this, but if there were just other concepts or ideas or concerns, or perhaps you don't think anything needs to change, we'd be interested to hear.
And before you respond, just going from left to right, and I don't think this question was perfect, so a grain of salt here as I read what's underneath. For those who can't read it, the left column on the graph is mitigate all impacts through development. So pretty much everything is mitigated on site. Then it was pay an additional amount, so additional fee in lieu amount. So that's something that Wendy's highlighted over there as require higher fee if units are not built. And there was, some interest in that. Limit the amount of mitigation that can be satisfied with a fee in lieu is the yellow bar. And then we also, when people just talked about it, people were like, well, actually what I really meant was continue with the current program, but let's tighten it up, exemptions and other things to on-site development. And those are the examples that Wendy's given. So on that, let's open it up for discussion here and see if we like at least the two ideas Wendy put out there. So Sky, I know you're multitasking. Anna, is this, when we say tightening things up, Anna, is this are these sort of good options for us to investigate?
Yeah.
All right,
it's weird language, but tighten up exemptions, to be honest. Continue with the current program with stricter exemptions. Seems like a double negative, both those things, but that's just me being the language person. I don't, if I read that, I'm not sure I would fully understand. I understand the potential modifications, those are very clear, but I'm just curious.
Can you guys tell me again what are the exemptions right now?
I was going to say, those are not exemptions. If you say tighten up the exemptions, those two things are modifications. Thank you, Tyler, for clarifying that.
Good point. And it may be something that we revisit because we're going to be hitting exemptions as its whole subject. So we may want to revisit it. It sounds like, though, people are at least not opposed to either tightening up the exemptions and also maybe looking at a higher fee if units aren't built. But we're definitely going to be discussing exemptions as its whole subject. So we'll cover that.
This is Rob. I think it's fine, but I don't think that you should specifically require units on site. If somebody wants to build them at another location, they should be allowed to, as long as they build them.
Yeah, that's a great point. I wanted to ask Jenna for a clarification, or Wendy, on the code. It's when we say on site, just to be clear, and it says that on or off site, it's just building units somewhere versus doing a fee, correct?
Yeah, there's first preference for on-site development, second preference for off-site. And actually this last item was labeled, the fourth item was labeled incorrectly. It should have said on or off-site.
Right.
In essence, the essence of this question is just to say, one, are we getting units built? If we're not getting them built as often as we want, how do we encourage them to get built either on or off-site? That's kind of the essence of the whole question.
So I'm gonna take the assumption from the group that preferences for on-site, or it can also be off-site rather than fee in lieu of, which is the spirit of the code now, and that we could look at or probably should look at, and this is a question, requiring a higher fee if units are not built on site, as maybe the preference, or is there anything else that we should look at, or should we just leave it the same and work on exemptions?
Can I ask a question? How would it work if somebody, Tyler, you're building a project and let's say you have some free market units and I was doing a development somewhere else, I could pay you to deed restrict them for me, right? And that would count as me building them, right? I would be providing them. How does that fit into all this? That's the same as mitigating by building a unit? if you supplement a private developer building something by paying them to then deed restrict it on behalf of your project?
I
Can
think so.
anyone confirm that's doable?
I don't know if Ryan is able to offer insight on that, but I believe because there are credits for development for pre-building units. So I know, for example, Paul gave an example of a hotel or another development coming in, and they actually, before they even submitted their commercial application, they built some workforce and affordable units offsite. And then they came in with their commercial application afterward, and then they were able to get credit for those units that they already built. So yes, there is ability to tap into either pre-build units, build them elsewhere, and get credit for them, or tap into existing projects.
That was definitely a timing thing. They were building them beforehand, but as far as, you know, if we have two concurrent projects, totally separate developers, one developer says the other one, hey, you know, pays into this ability to utilize the other project as their housing through deed restriction. I don't know that that's in there. I need to look. That's a little bit different. It's a good point. Let me make a note of that one.
Yeah.
We're
I think you
in
might be
the
talking about our
process of something
project.
like that right now, Rob.
Yeah.
Oh, you're doing that right now?
Yeah, no, it's definitely not 100% approved, but so far, talking to Paul Anthony, that is kind of what we're gonna do. We're gonna pay somebody else for a housing credit for one of our projects because they already had something built.
Okay.
And in that case, Tyler, is it existing inventory or was it
It
in
is
development,
existing.
or did you? So
This one is existing.
is a mitigation option for developers to pay somebody who owns free market apartments to deed restrict them? So it's not adding inventory, it's adding deed restrictions. That is a form of mitigation today, available today.
Yeah, I believe that's either the fourth choice. It's like a
Okay.
on-site, off-site. Yeah, you can deed restrict existing, you can deed land in lieu, you can do a fee.
And then fee is last. Okay.
And Rob, we have had success. We have deed restricted something that we owned that was free market. We have deed restricted it to meet the requirement.
Okay.
So I'm going to put Wendy on the spot here, or Ashley, and say, given what you've heard, and then I'm going to get feedback from Melissa. Given what you heard, Wendy, that, you know, maybe we're okay with this sort of prioritization.
Mhm.
Is there a problem here we're trying to solve, or are we okay with leaving the system as is and working on making sure just everything's tight, especially with exemptions?
That's kind of, I guess where I'm sitting is I'd be interested to hear input on kind of all the other policy items as well, because then the whole picture of how everything works together comes together.
Great point.
And then we can see if there's, additional thoughts that come out of that process. Kind of, I would say my initial reaction to what we hear on this is that things kind of seem to be working, and, maybe not a whole lot to do, but at the same time, there's definite ideas there that we could borrow on if needed, so.
Melissa, we haven't heard from you. Are you okay with the direction of this conversation?
Thanks, Bruce. I generally am. I guess I just had a question, and I apologize if you covered this. I had a call come in that I had to take real quick, but the modification to require a higher fee if the units are not built. I mean, I guess I thought the whole point of the fee is when the units are not built. So you're just saying raise the fees. That the intention there would be to raise the fees from what they are now.
Right, and I was exploring maybe not doing that, and maybe we have it right since there hasn't been an overwhelming push to do that. So right now, I think it's let's come back to this question, but we may not have a problem. So that's an option we can consider, but it's not a high priority option right now.
Okay, I would agree with that, and would agree with the comments that were made too, that building, on-site would be preferable, but certainly would be allowed off-site.
Very good. All right, we're going to leave this question as is and keep on time. So we're going to move forward. All right, so we are into the actual discussion here and everyone's favorite part. So we'll be getting into some polling here as we go, but we're going to start off with median family income range, knowing that the current LDRs really does try to target units at a certain income. And maybe Jen, this is a good place for you to jump in, talk a little bit about what the code says, and maybe start teeing off a conversation between this and the next slide with Wendy about where we should be going. You know, and who can't have a good meeting with babies on the screen? So babies and dogs. So
sorry for the distraction, but I wanted to say hi to everybody.
oh, that's not fair.
Guy, can you bring the baby to every meeting? I just made the meeting.
I'll try. I'll see what her schedule looks like.
If anyone gets upset or disgruntled, the baby goes up. So that's right. That's right. Exactly. That's awesome. All right, Jen.
All right.
All right.
All right.
Let Jen get distracted because I know we'll lose her.
I know, I'm just staring at the baby, but now I'll look over at the slide. So I know everyone on the phone should know this information already, but we just wanted to kind of place it out there in kind of a flow chart fashion to show you how all the pieces tie together in the current LDR. So we use the example of an office space, a 10,000 square foot office, which is kind of the same metric we've been using throughout all of these examples. A 10,000 square foot office based on the calculations of the new full mitigation, proposed full mitigation through the new Nexus report would result in a need for 8.8 units. As we all know, that fractional portion, the 0.8, can be paid as a fee in lieu. And as we already said, some of those are getting placed as units. But looking at the whole number, then there's another section of the code that drops down and says you need to meet these 4 different MFI target ranges. So there's a certain percentage of under 50, or certain percentage of units need to be provided at less than 50% MFI, a certain percentage at 50 to 80, 80 to 120, and 120 to 200. And those percentages are at least 25% at that negative, less than 50, at least 19% at the 50 to 80, no more than 43% at the 80 to 120, and no more than 13% at the 120 to 200. So based on a table in the code and some those percentages, you end up with this particular scenario, needing 2 units at that less than 50, 2 units at 50 to 80, 3 units at 81 to 120, and 1 unit at 120 to 200. Then there's one more step where you have to figure out how many bedrooms are allocated per those units. So that is broken down by one bedroom and studio units needing 3, 4 2-bedroom units, and 1 3-bedroom unit. So lots of numbers I just threw out there, but as you can see by the chart, this is how the LDRs break it down. So once you have your use and your square footage, you get your resulting units, and then that spurs out into the MFI ranges and bedroom allocation.
All right, so just remember sort of, and take a look at the lower and the higher ends there. Just remember those. We're going to go to another slide in a second. But Sky, did you have a question, or you're like you're good to go? I think that's good to go. The thumbs up. So,
Yeah, just making sure I heard right. It's less than 50 in that first box.
Yeah. So looking at those higher and lower ends, just remember those, because those at least help me make sense of what we're discussing here. Maybe we'll jump to the next slide and then open it up, and then we'll do a little polling here. Maybe Wendy, you want to take this one?
Yeah, this is probably where all the flooded questions are going to come. So that's fine. That's why we're here. But so in essence, I mean, the issue here that we want to talk about is, should the required MFI ranges, which are shown in this table on the bottom left and talk about or shows the percentages that Jennifer just quoted, Should the required MFI categories be altered in light of community housing needs and what other programs are accomplishing? You know, as you guys know, when this program was brought in 1994, you didn't really have a whole lot of other programs contributing to your affordable and workforce housing deed restricted stock. You know, it was pretty much the mitigation program. You know, I think the Housing Trust had started in 1990, so they were doing some stuff. Obviously, the, you know, public sources and whatever, but, you know, like Habitat for Humanity didn't get going until 95. So, you know, this program was really brought in with the intent to do it, so to speak. And so, you know, obviously things have changed a lot since then, you know, and so this pie chart to the right is kind of showing how those changes of what has changed in essence. So when we take a look at affordable deed restricted and workforce deed restricted units that were produced between 2018 and 2022, so recent, we see that the mitigation program, you know, produced about 27% or 91 of the units during that period. The reason why 2018 was a start point is because that's when you brought in this incentive 2-for-1 program. Okay, so that's why we're kind of looking at this cutout. And this was some information we presented last time, but just shown in a different format. Your incentive program has been going gangbusters, and it has produced 123 units, all workforce deed restricted, or 36% of your affordable and workforce unit production since 2018, okay? Public-private partnerships have produced about 76 units, or about 23% during this period. Your preservation program, which recently got started as well, about 7 units, and that's basically purchasing deed restrictions on existing units with a workforce deed restriction. And then other, which, you know, this includes some employer units, et cetera, just kind of other units coming online. And so those vary, but you had about 42 units of that happen since 2018. And so the point of this was to take a look, okay, you know, recognizing that our program's shifted, you know, we have other programs that are contributing to our housing stock. And so the real question is, does it still make sense for the workforce, the mitigation program, to hit this entire range? Like, for example, the 120 to 200, this is your workforce deed restriction. So obviously these percentages are a little out of whack right now, I think, as you guys know, with the current housing market. I think the workforce deed restriction is now hitting a little bit around 140, 150 and higher, especially for sale product. Do we really need it to hit this area when a third of your units that were produced in the past 4 years came from your incentive program, and it's doing gangbusters in this set? In other words, think about how this program should fit in the production of units, what it's good at producing, as opposed to, and what other programs have trouble producing that this one can do. You know, I would say the other component, and I'd love to hear from you guys on this, is this less than 50. Honestly, you know, looking at other communities and what they do, there's very few that require them to go this low, in part in recognition that to produce units less than 50, really the nonprofit and the public sector that have access to like tax credit funds, you know, and other sources of financing are really typically best suited to hit that low. But then also looking at the income profile of your worker households. And I think, you know, a lot of times when you have a 2-person worker household earning 2 incomes, they're going to be above this point anyway. It also depends on your product, because obviously your seasonal workers in dorms, okay, they're going to be in here. And so I think this is sort of the gist of this conversation. I'm wondering if I want to stop here or should I move
And Wendy,
to?
what about,
next
you
slide?
answered, Melissa's question that, does this include, the community housing trust and habitat constructed units?
Yes, that's in this public-private green little piece of the pie. This is all, so this includes your housing trust, this includes habitat, this includes the housing authority, the public-private partnerships.
Wendy, do
public
you
fund-
have the less than 50% what the rents are or the prices are for condos, for individual condos? I remember a couple of years ago, I mean, that's obviously the struggle is those are so low, the values are so minimal, you know, as a developer, you're losing a few $100,000 per unit.
Right.
Do you have those, the recent or updated numbers?
I
don't have them at my
Ashley, do you
fingertips,
know
but
that?
I can pull them up during the course of this conversation.
Okay.
And you're absolutely right, Tyler. Like we were finding when we did this last time, not only was a subsidy, not only were we subsidizing the full development of these units, basically, they even needed like operational subsidy.
Yeah, because I think we were looking at, now this is 4 years ago, the numbers have changed since then, but we were doing condos and to sell the for sale price for the under 50% was like 60 something $1,000. We had to sell the condo for that. And obviously the condo was hundreds to build. I was just curious what they were. And then also what is that income in Jackson? As you said, you know, we are doing a tax credit project right now, low income tax credit. And one of my worries is, you know, people working 30 hours a week in Jackson, but still making too little of money. You know, they're almost making too much to even qualify for that now. So I'd like to see what those numbers are as well.
Actually, do you want to jump to the next slide really quick, Kelly? Because I think that'll help answer the question you just asked. And Ashley, you might help me with this one if I start stumbling because this is out of your Nexus study. But basically, this was a breakout from the Nexus study. And, you know, what it did is it looked at the income profile in each of these different commercial categories of workers in those categories. And then figured out, okay, with assumptions of, what was it, 1.7 workers per household, what their income would be and where they would fall on the MFI scale for Teton County. And it was actually found like the under 80 is consolidated. Ashley, perhaps you can elaborate, because I recall the under 50 was really, really low because of the 1.7 person household. Right.
Yeah, when we first looked at this distribution, we kept the under 50 separated, and in most categories there were 0 households showing up in that category, and so we decided to aggregate it for presentation purposes. That's not to say it's truly 0. It's just that by the time you have multiple earners per household, we're exceeding that 50% for a 3-person household.
Mm-hmm.
But you explained the rest of it perfectly. We take the number of households generated and looking at occupation and wage data across those land use categories, we then have a sense of how much these employee households are earning, and we distribute them accordingly. And
then the other interesting thing from this is with the update of the 2023 study, there really wasn't a subsidy when you start getting above 163%, so about 160 or so. There's really no subsidy left, you know, that you need to do anyway. It also shows that the vast majority of your workforce is earning, anywhere from about 60 to almost 100% of your employees in every category is earning under 120% of the area median income. And then the vast majority obviously are earning under 163. And so really your workforce product that doesn't have an income cap or a price cap, in essence, are largely serving, you know, this higher range for which, honestly, your jobs just aren't creating a ton of jobs in that area.
And Wendy, maybe you can go to the next slide and then we should see if we can answer Sky's question right after that. So,
Okay. Yeah, and so then the next slide this is basically showing the same thing except for residential development. So it's just showing the distribution of jobs by income level in each of these categories. And basically, without repeating myself, shows the same thing that I was just saying. Most are earning under 120% area median income, and definitely very few are earning up in kind of this workforce category.
Yeah, and residential follows a little bit of a different proportion than the non-residential. We get proportionally more employee households generated in that above 120% cohort than we do on the non-residential side.
And Ashley, can you look in the chat and see if you can answer that question? That one's definitely for you.
Where is it?
And I can read it out loud too.
Yeah, Sky's asking, would the legal nexus require linking the requirement categories to the community's MFI categories or to working families MFI categories? And we use the MFI categories as posted by the housing department. And in order to calculate a fee that's aligned with the on-site mitigation requirement, I do need to go through this exercise of, slotting them into their income categories, because the subsidies for each of these income cohorts varies, and that's really the underpinning of the fee. So I see that as part of the legal process.
So
But
Thank you. And I guess the question I was trying to ask is, one of you had asked, should we adjust this to maybe take off the upper end or the lower end? So my question is that legally permissible, or do we have to stick with all categories that show up in the data? And I guess when I saw your last slide, I'm curious if, the same, like everything needs to match this nexus, like should the categories where almost all the job creation is below 80, should they have to do their mitigation below 80, whereas the categories that have a broader range, should they have to do a broader range? Like, how granular does it become for the legal question?
Yeah, it's a good question, and really it is policy at this point. Once we go through the exercise of calculating how many households and identifying which income cohorts they fall into, it is just simply a policy question for the community. Who do we want to serve with this mitigation program? I do want to make sure that there's alignment between the on-site mitigation requirement and the fee. If we eventually depart from that alignment, that's okay too. That's a policy conversation. But at least at this stage of things, I want the on-site requirement to be aligned with the fee. But it's absolutely a policy decision which income cohorts we want to target with this program.
And I'll put Ashley and Wendy on the spot here, since this is a hard question that we're going to go and we're going to do the polling on what range this is applicable, and let you choose multiple ranges. Maybe just some observations on the data from Wendy and Ashley, like what does it tell you? And I'm asking you to maybe share some insights, and whether everyone else agrees it or not doesn't really matter. Just sort of observations compared to other places.
Sure. Yeah. Actually, Kelly, you want to go up 2 slides? Go back to the pie chart, just so people can reference it. In a nutshell, my observation is, one, I think you have plenty of workforce units coming from other sources. I don't think you need to be adding any more of those to your market based on the income profile of who actually is making their living in your community. And honestly, the incentive program is super well suited for that, obviously, because it's doing gangbusters. I don't think in my opinion, there's no reason.
Okay, any questions before we go? And we're going to try our first polling exercise here.
I'll add one more observation just from other communities I've worked in. I think Wendy's still frozen. She was talking about sort of the upper end workforce. One of the things we've noted in these programs that where we've done this work is that targeting much below low, so below 80%, is not only is the subsidy huge, relatively larger, it is often difficult to qualify some of these households for ownership housing. So there's, you needing to qualify for the mortgage, but then there are all of the other expenses that go along with owning a home, HOAs and utilities and insurance and that sort of thing. And it's often very challenging for households to qualify for home ownership at much below 80%.
All right, so couple of points there. In some ways, there's not not many funding streams go to that, but also it's a difficult range to address. All right, well, let's go to the polling question then, and let's see if we can do this. And wow, that's pretty nice. All right, so again, it's if everyone remembers, you pull out your phone and you go to, or your computer, and you go to menti.com or www.menti.com, and then type in that code and you should be able to select multiple. And then who joined us from the chamber? Either Chris from the chamber or
Rick.
Yeah. So, who's that?
Rick Howe.
Rick?
I'm in Saratoga, so I can't do the video because it's not as the signal isn't as strong. So.
Saratoga, New York, watching horses, or Saratoga, Wyoming, the hot springs? Which one?
Saratoga, Wyoming, dodging antelope. So.
Oh, nice. All right, just confirming. And then the 303 number, is that, who's that?
That is me. Sorry, guys. My internet.
Oh,
Oh,
back.
I'm back.
Great.
Very good.
Okay. Am I still here?
You are, you're
We can hear you.
unplugged, so-
Okay, cool. Good, you did voting. Okay.
All right, so far, let's see, we got 1, 2, 3. Okay, so just 2 people, so a few more people need to join in here.
And to say just what's on the instructions, it's select all that apply, right? So you're putting your dream program together. Who should we be serving? Which income cohort should we be serving with this program?
1, 2, 3, 4. And Rick, did you say you could vote or you couldn't where you are?
I can. My phone is fine. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 max. And we have 6. Talk about a balanced program. So let's talk a little bit on some of the those that chose the less than 50, and then we'll go to those that chose the 120 to 200 and the reason why. So clearly most people chose where the greatest demand was, according to Ashley, but let's talk a little bit about who chose A. At least 2 people chose A.
I selected all of them to represent the workforce that I need for my businesses.
Rob?
And I also chose A. I think it would be interesting to see that breakout of the 0 to 50 between the 50 to 80 in some of the use categories that have most of their jobs in the below 80. And if it's still like almost 0, then maybe we don't need it. I guess in that case, could we put those 2 categories together into a 0 to 80?
Mm-hmm.
I would not want to just get rid of below 50 and say, if you're below 50, you can't be part of this, like let them try to qualify in a 0 to 80. But, if there are a fair number of people in that category being generated by the retail service restaurant or lodging, then it seems like we should keep it in the mix.
Yeah, I also think you have to make it, as Tyler was alluding to, you have to have an economically reasonable model for somebody to develop a real pot of units. And if the workforce helps pay for some of the less than 50 from the person who ends up owning this multifamily asset at the end of the day, that has to be considered, because if it's not feasible, you're just going to turn them. I mean, maybe, I don't know how you'd solve for that, right? I don't know. The business, if an expense of a restaurant is supplementing housing, restaurant margins are like 12%. You know, I just coming back to the restaurants, no one's ever going to build a restaurant in Jackson again. So I don't know. I think it would be wonderful if there's a way to like network projects together to the sum of the parts to build projects. Or Tyler, you go in the development business and build for everybody. Because you're going to need a balanced, you know, set of rents to be able to actually build stuff.
Yeah, and that's why I was one of the ones for E, is just to try to balance, you know, more of the B's and C's and even A's. Is, you know, you got to have a balance, or just, you know, you end up getting nothing. I still would like to see what that income is for 50%.
Yeah,
I feel like everybody's over that. I feel like that's truly working full time.
All right, let's see, you haven't heard from Anna? Go ahead, Anna.
No, I was just curious. Is Tyler's question, what are you earning if you earn less than 50% MFI?
Yes.
It's up to 47,000 per household.
Okay, so anybody under 47?
Basically the habitat numbers.
And it's a household, not an individual wage.
Yeah, it can go up a bit, but it's right in there.
I'm also looking at the number of households that are falling into our, you know, up to 50, and it's sort of on the range of 0 to 0.1 to 0.2, varies by land use category. Not nothing across the board, but pretty minimal.
So I can't remember who just said this, but does it, at some point, is there the, you know, the networking idea? I mean, if developers can't build for less than 50% MFI, why doesn't mitigation payment go to the developer who can build for that? Like Habitat.
And that actually is what some of the funds are used for. So the mitigation fees that are collected. Yeah, I have some, and I can share them with you when April finalizes them, but you know, per some of the questions that came out last time is, you know, to what extent are mitigation fees being used to help with the public-private development? So that piece of the pie that's been happening. And so she still has some work to do on this, but I can share it with you guys. But yes, you know, those funds can be used to leverage, you know, the public, nonprofit developers that can get additional state and federal financing as well to hit this kind of less than 50 segment.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Wendy, you were posing that question though. You know, there might be other funding sources for that A. So that's a consideration, but what we're seeing here is, and then we'll get Melissa and Rick to respond, is to continue with a very balanced program with a lot of it targeted towards the greatest need on the workforce. Not necessarily by income, but by units. So, do you want to jump in, Melissa? And then we'll end with Rick.
Sure, thanks. So I voted for C and D after hearing the comments that below 80% are really difficult to build. And I appreciate that we have Habitat for Humanity, and they have been active and well supported in this community. So that seems like a better way to go for those lower range. And then the workforce, I do see that is really well taken care of with incentives, and I think that's absolutely appropriate. And we need those units. I'm just not sure that those make sense to target for mitigation.
All right, Rick.
Yes, and I did B, C, and D, hearing some of the comments and wasn't taking into consideration, I think what Anna just said, about offering, some mitigation more towards steering towards that. But hearing some of the comments earlier is that also takes a lot more to manage, if you will, from the data point when a good percentage of those people may not qualify because, as some people have said, some of those wage levels are already being met if you have a full-time job. But, again, that's not being inclusive to those that may not. I mean, we don't know exactly what everybody's situation is, but I think if you could add some more of those fees towards A, then yes, if it incentivizes them to build it or because of those reasons, then I would absolutely say that. But when I initially voted, it was the B, C, and D for the reasons that were specified earlier.
So what we're hearing is more of a comprehensive housing program with some caveats that, A could be a little bit more difficult or has some other funding sources. But right now, most people are generally looking for a more balanced program. Is that a fair summation? Thumbs up. It's not a heart, Rob, though. This guy was good. Someone was giving me hearts before, so. But.
And just one question, Bruce. Going back to that data, was I reading it right that 90% of the jobs in retail, service, restaurant, and lodging are all below 80%? And it sounds like very few of those are below 50. So, 90% we could say are basically between 50 and 80% AMI, which I think that's kind of like, that's a huge informative data point that at least I didn't know before this. So seems like a super important point to keep in mind throughout the process.
Yeah, I think that's, I saw Ashley nodding.
Yeah, that's true. The land use category that has the highest share of below 50% is actually lodging. But retail, service, restaurant has 0 households showing up in the below 50% MFI. Kind of surprisingly to me, actually. But lodging has.
How current is the data on incomes? That 47,000 per household at 1.7 people is the below 50. The wages in the lodging sector, I don't know anybody getting paid under $20 an hour. So if you have one, that's 40,000 a year if they're full time. So I think to Tyler's point, maybe those are part-time workers in the under 50. Unless you round them up as if they are FTEs, full-time workers. But I don't know how old the data is.
Well, the data, the 47,000 figure that's posted by the housing department, and it's refreshed every year. So that is as current as it gets, but it's not necessarily a reflection of, it is adjusted to reflect the, factors in the community, but it's derived from federal data for the county.
Okay.
Well, and that being said, it includes everybody in your community. So it would include those who are not working. So like seniors on fixed income, for example, are included in the formation of that data. So it includes all residents in your community. It's not just your workforce, if that helps.
So it includes the people that are working from their homes, trading family funds and making a couple $1 million a year.
If
are dragging that up.
If they're earning less than 50% AMI, HUD data is based on census data, ACS, et cetera, of household incomes. And so the less than 50 group, when the Department of Housing and Urban Development creates its income ranges for communities, is based on the residents in that community. So it's not just based on the workforce.
We're running into something like this on our tax credit project because we have to fit the tax credit project rules, and also Teton County, the housing department rules, where they have to work 30 hours for a local business. So people on Social Security are not qualifying for the Teton County housing department. So having to have them fit in both boxes is a struggle. And I think something we should think about here, I guess, if they're truly working 30+ hours for a local company to be in our deed restrictions.
Right.
Anna, Rob, final comments on this one, knowing that, there was some questions on that on A, and we'll note that, we'll note that there is some hesitation on A, but this is where we sit. Any final comments before we move on? And move on is to a break, by the way, for 5 minutes.
No, I'm good, thanks.
Nothing to add.
Because I said the word break, and so on that note, this has been awesome. People are right on track. We are going to take a short 5-minute break. No one leave, because we need you all on this one, and 4:38. We'll see you all back here. Enjoy trivia, and see you back here in 5 minutes. what I realized from logo trivia, unlike an exam question where your first answer is always supposed to be correct. In terms of logos, always choose the one you don't think it is. All right, let's do let's see, all right. Got Tyler's back, check. Anna, you're back. Sky's back, thank you. Rob, are you back? Yes. Bob?
Yeah.
Great, Rick?
I'm nodding my head, yes.
All right, and did we lose Melissa? Please shall rejoin.
Yeah, it looks like we lost Melissa, but we'll see if she makes it back. I'll let her back in.
Okay. So next our next couple ones are fairly straightforward. And I think they go easier to hard, but we'll find out. So we're going to jump into change of use and talk a little bit about some of the code language and see if we want to do any modifications for change of use. It's helpful, and maybe I'll have Jen read it just because I know she's eating. So I just saw that, Jen, sorry. But it's helpful for me if you to read. Can you just read the small print language? Because some people are having trouble reading it. Code language is helpful.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So the current code language, and this is section 6.3.3A or of the LDRs, it says, in the case of a change of use, the amount of affordable workforce housing required shall be the difference between the requirement of the proposed use and the requirement for the existing use. And there's a few other disclaimers in how to determine the use and when it, which is the existing use, and that's also in that section. But this is kind of that key piece of language.
So if it goes up and your change of use increases, you've got to add more mitigation. Any observations? There's a couple there that maybe Ashley, Wendy, or Jen, you want to hit in terms of we put them as concerns raised, but maybe observations.
Wendy might have some more relevant observations, but I'll just remind the group that we tried to take some of this into account in our technical work by combining, last year when we were doing this, by combining retail, services, and restaurants. So we were acutely aware of the change of use with respect to restaurants and wanting to account for that as best as possible by aggregating that land use category so that between retail, restaurant, and services, there would be no change of use.
That's a great actually point to make, Ashley. Thank you.
Yeah, so sorry guys, my internet obviously is flaking out on me today, but I'm back on phone. And I kind of missed the introduction, I suppose. So I don't know if the example was given.
Yeah, it was. We're mainly talking
Okay.
about maybe any observations we have. What we point out there is clearly that, if someone does change use, that sometimes it will impact the incoming business or at least the owner of that, and it doesn't really affect the, and not the developer itself. And it's also, very difficult, I think, when we're talking to planning, to try to account for these changes of use as we go forward. You have to keep track of them and be able to manage them even after the development proposal and so on. And the certificate of occupancy has been given. So that will be the nature of the question of whether we want to even address change of use or maybe even say goodbye to it.
Yeah. Well, and I think honestly, I'm interested to hear from the group if there's kind of pros and cons in addition to these that they've seen or not to change of use. And then when we have that discussion, I do have some examples from other communities as to what they do when it comes to change of use and how they deal with it. So I can provide that context if people are interested.
So we're looking for just maybe pros and cons that people have. of having a change of use policy, which is currently in the code. And maybe pros and cons of not having it before we ask you that question through polling.
I see, the con of not having it is people are going to try to develop to the lowest denominator kind of thing, and then later change it back to restaurant or whatever. So I can see that as being an issue. But I have seen it become an issue where there was a retail place in town. It was empty. Landlord's trying to rent it. They're going to rent it to an architectural firm for office. Change of use was like $40-something thousand. The rent was 40-something thousand. And the landlord told the tenant to pay for it. And he's like, I'm only signing a 3-year lease. Why would I pay a full year up front and then pay 3 years rent? So they couldn't come to who was going to pay it between landlord and tenant. And then it never happened. And then it sat vacant for another 6+ months. So that was kind of a negative of there's a big battle between landlord and tenant of who pays for it. I understand it stays with the land and you could easily push it on the landlord. I get that. But from a landlord's perspective, they'll be like, all right, I'll wait another 3 months and hold off until I find somebody for the same use.
Great example. So, all right. Any other sort of just observations we're making on this before we?
I don't know what the other examples are, but from the Chambers days, I mean, it stunts innovation just at a macro level.
So,
And it particularly hurts small businesses in that arena.
yeah, you could definitely see it being cumbersome. But on the pure sense, it makes sense, but being able to administrate it as a user, as a renter, or being able to do it, or from the city, from the town and county, it's a little bit troublesome. Rick?
Yeah, I had a question about, if a business is going to come in and it's a lesser requirement, forgive me for not knowing this up front, but does that then go into a credit pool that can be utilized by other businesses that was vacated against, if that makes sense?
I'm going to defer to Jen, even though
Yeah.
you can say I'll get back to you.
Yes, this is a question that I actually had as well, and I haven't found anything in the current LDRs anyway that state that you can, so to speak, bank them, but there is banked units, so I don't know if there's a way to tie those two together. So
yeah, because Anna was just stating towards a smaller business sector, those would be the ones that it seems to me are penalized the most with some of this. So I'm just thinking high level here, why not create something that says, and I don't know how many of this there would be, but at least it would say those could then be credited towards that particular sector to assist with the creation of new businesses in that category.
Well, and I can offer a little bit of insight too as to what currently happens, because Ryan might jump in as well. But as I understand it, if a less intensive employment use moves into a space that had mitigated at a higher use, then yes, there is a credit, but it stays attached to that space. So, for example, if an office moved into a restaurant, what was a restaurant, the office is a less intensive use, the credit stays with that. So then if that office then moved out and a restaurant later moved back in, that restaurant moving back in would not have to mitigate again because the credit stays with the building.
Yeah, okay, I get that. Thank you. Thanks for the update.
Yeah.
Kind of.
We're in the process of moving some credits around, but it's kind of what you were saying. It's within the same building, multi-tenant building, where we're moving it from, giving you an example, 101 is going from office to retail. So now there's a credit, and then that credit from 101 is going to 103. That's going from recreation up to retail. We've done that, and we're in the process of that right now. But that again was still on the same site, same building.
Okay.
All right, and Melissa, you're unmuted, and do you want to jump in here?
No, sorry, I didn't mean to be unmuted.
Oh, I called on you. Oh, okay. I'll give you a pass on that, Melissa. So Sky, are you jumping in?
Yeah, something that had come up last time around, but I don't think went anywhere, was the idea of aggregating all the uses, at least like on the residential and then the non-residential side. And then you don't need a change of use at all, at least as long as you're staying residential or not. I think with any of this, it's like the more you aggregate, the more you're helping the businesses that have higher job creation, and the more you're harming the businesses that have lower job creation. So you're essentially, helping retail, service, restaurant, lodging, hurting office. So, depending who you are, that's either a good thing or a bad thing, but it would certainly make a much simpler system to just aggregate everything and have no change of use. So I'm curious what the people on the development side think about that. I don't know if it would be a good or bad thing, but it seems like a very different approach that might be good or might be a terrible idea.
Sky, you're saying, so no change of use?
Yeah, just have one use for all, non-residential. So it's retail,
Okay.
service, restaurant, lodging,
It's all one.
office,
And that's from a
institutional.
development, like from the start.
Yeah, just average it all out
Okay.
up front, have one fee for all of it, and then nobody ever needs to worry about a change of use from the mitigation perspective.
I get that. I'll give you guys a real life example. You guys that are familiar with 155 West Gill, it used to be Teton Aquatics. So there's a pool in the back. It was a 12 foot deep pool. They taught people how to do scuba diving and everything for like 30 years. So we bought that building, and Grace Salon is where the ranch in, where Crystal Creek's doing the new condos. So they're tearing all of that down. Grace Salon has been there for, I don't know how many, over 10 years, maybe 20 years. So she is moving from the ranch in spot that's getting demoed into the old Teton Aquatic space where the pool was. So we filled in the pool. She's going in there. The housing mitigation fee for that change of use was like $70,000. It's like, all right, who pays for that? And that's just an example where, coming as she truly is a small business, I think those are the kind of people we're all in favor of. All right, who's going to pay for that fee? And is it landlord? Is it that? And then if the landlord pays for it, as Rob mentioned earlier, all right, what does that do to rent? When I'm like, all right, I'm going to give you, a full year or 2 years worth of quote free rent because I got to pay a fee for you to move in. Those are kind of the main issues I'm running into. I see, like, moving forward for new development, maybe doing it different. Maybe it is kind of like Sky's saying, but from the old stuff, I'm for no change of use for anything that's already built.
I think that's a great call. And I think, though, that lodging can be separated out as a third category. So residential, lodging, and retail,
Other.
restaurant, service, office would all be the same. I don't think you'd hurt office. All you're doing is just they have less of a benefit than the other ones. But you're stimulating entrepreneurs and small businesses in the community with that in reusing existing space. The way we're growing, we want people to use existing space. We don't want them to build new stuff and leave other stuff empty.
Agree.
So let's go to the question and come back to some options are, since and if no change of use could mean consolidating. And I want to make sure that Wendy, you're okay with that. We can do it as other. So
Actually,
get rid of change of use. I gotta be clear. Get rid of change of use would be could mean consolidating or not doing it. Want to make sure we poll correctly. You want to jump in here on how we should do this?
yeah, so actually, if we have time, you guys have hit precisely on some things that other communities are doing. I'd be happy to offer more insight to that if it would help some of you think through this.
I think so, because people are already suggesting some different options here. So
Okay, no, this is great. So I'll start with Vail. The town of Vail has commercial linkage, and then they have inclusionary zoning for residential. They have 7 different categories of commercial use. Their differences between categories are very similar to the ones that show up in Jackson. So obviously bar restaurant is way higher than retail is higher than office. They do not have a change of use policy. If a change comes in, only if they add new square footage that's the only time they have to mitigate for the change. So basically it's just, if you're going to add new square footage, then you mitigate the new square footage at your current use. They have had this policy in for 10 years. I spoke with the leading planning director. He said he can count on one hand the number of times that developers have potentially taken advantage of this and built lower and then put in higher. His quote was, if we did change of use in Vail, we would be endlessly chasing our tail. and I think that gets kind of to Anna's point, it would be, just depressing kind of the natural flow and the turnover of businesses and the evolution of businesses that happen in that community. So that's one example. A second example is Telluride and Crested Butte. They're both very similar, but they follow what was brought up about merging just one commercial category and having one fee for all commercial. Then they have a separate job generation for lodging, and then they have a separate job generation for the residential products. Okay. They do require a change of use from residential to commercial, but because they only have one commercial category, they do not require a change of use with any of the commercial changeovers. Okay. For example, Telluride's commercial job generation is 4.5 employees per 1,000 square feet, and that's it. And yeah, so that's pretty much the three goals, but it hits everything that you guys brought up. So in light of that, I would agree, Bruce, I think, maybe we have, I guess we have our choices selected.
Yeah.
But one would be to change of use. One would be to require.
Right. So if if you're pulling, this should work. Yeah, already. So just get rid of it completely, and we can talk about consolidation afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Just do it based on the mitigation of just new square footage, or no, and then we can talk about consolidation of categories.
Yeah.
All
And I
right.
have more examples. I don't think we need them.
I don't know. I think you might be good, Wendy. Hold on. So just a couple more. So another, okay. And I think we got one more person.
Did we decide other means the Telluride model or something?
So you want to repeat, yeah, in your mind, Wendy, is that get rid of change of use, or is it other?
B is basically get rid of change of use. I think other would probably encompass something like Telluride, because what you're wanting to do is both aggregate completely into one commercial zone and get rid of change of use. But honestly, I think we might need to get clarification from those that say other to make sure that everyone's on that same page.
If you're voting for anything of yellow or the orange, we'll have a discussion, but it implies most likely getting rid of change of use and some form of consolidation, sounds like. But we'll verify that as we have the discussion. Okay, who did not vote?
I have not voted yet. I can't vote for two.
All right, very good. All right, so and then Ashley, before we and we'll also hear Wendy's final example here, but Ashley, you had already recommended the consolidation. I mean, you said that pretty directly, right?
Yeah, we talked about this from a policy perspective early on. We did all agree, the prior group agreed on the consolidation of retail, restaurant, service. Sky's exactly right. If there is further, we are trying to balance aggregating while not masking very real differences that we see. So not that it can technically, it can absolutely be done, but we would be sort of would be asking more of some of the lower employment generating uses and asking less of some of the higher employment generating uses. So it's just trade-offs, but technically it's absolutely possible.
Okay, and Wendy, and do you have a final example or an option that's different than what we've talked about?
I do, but I hesitate to bring it up because I think it's kind of messy. Aspen's taken probably the most unique approach. What they've done is they've created,
No, sorry, I wasn't coughing because I was in shock. I just was clearing my throat. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. They actually have job generation rates by zone. And so that in essence gets rid of their change of use requirement because they just aggregate all the types of businesses that could be allowed in each zone. And then they have a different generation rate in that respect. Like I said, it's very unique, would be kind of very messy, honestly, I think for Jackson, and also would throw, I think, a pretty big recalculation loop in the nexus. And I honestly, if you guys are moving toward just one commercial aggregation, I think that's much more simple and probably makes more sense, but that's my opinion.
Right, unique is not always better, or new is not always better. So
Yeah.
Can I ask which program, Vail or the Telluride Crested Butte program, seems to be most effective to support small businesses and generate housing?
Well, I would say Telluride and Crested Butte have been more aggressive to use their program to generate housing. And so and they, well, Telluride not so much anymore. Crested Butte at the time, both of them had a little more land for Vail to develop. Vail is a little unique because they don't have a lot of new development opportunity now. 10 years ago, they had some land. They don't really have land left now. So it's pretty much redevelopment and, well, changing uses. So that's why it's such a nightmare to manage. It's hard to say. The nice thing about the Telluride Crested Butte with aggregating the commercial and getting rid of the change of use is it takes away the argument of, what was brought up before of the concern of a developer coming in at an office use and then all of a sudden putting a restaurant in it. They're both at the same level as opposed to office being a lot lower. That being said, I think the reality of that having happened in Vail is extremely low. So I don't know. That doesn't really answer your question. I guess mainly because I don't really have a firm answer.
all right, so we're gonna go around and see what, so I want you to speak not only to, clearly it's most likely getting rid of the change of use, but also to either another program or consolidation as we go around, and we'll sort of keep a tally here. Any volunteers to go first? I know it's a little bit of a tough one, but
My note on other was to consolidate them into the three categories. Lodging and residential being separate from office, restaurant, retail, because those spaces kind of would be the same area. I mean, if somebody took a big office building and turned it into condos, that's a change of use. But if they took an office building and turned it into a restaurant and retail, I don't know. I think you'd stifle that if you didn't consolidate.
so Rob, to be clear, it's consolidate, but still, if they change uses, there is mitigation.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but there's only three categories of
Right.
change of use. Yeah.
Okay.
Consolidating all the ones that are likely to affect small businesses.
All right. Next Melissa, you want to try going first since I get let you off hook before going second here?
I like going last. Thanks, Bruce.
You bet. Rick.
Yeah, I mean, I'm along the same lines as what Rob is saying too. I mean, getting rid of the changes of use, consolidating, so consolidating the uses so that what categories you end up with are somewhat similar. And yeah, I mean, that's the best way to put it. I mean, there's nothing really more that needs to be said. Not overcomplicating it, actually simplifying the process based upon the data we already have.
So consolidating, but still allowing mitigation with some change of use.
Correct.
Okay. That's Scott.
Yeah, I think it's, I'd just love to know more about those other communities who have tried the different policies and if they would report, oh, this is awesome, and it probably depends who you ask. But if there's a community consensus in Telluride that like business owners, housing advocates, and the town government all love their policy, I would lean pretty hard towards that one. That also feels pretty reasonable just as a gut check. So, you know, if I had to vote today, I would support the like mega aggregated, but 3 like Rob was describing as well. But it's, you know, since other towns are doing it, let's find out what works.
Okay, so not opposed to that. So that'll be noted in the record that, you know, you could consider it. But right now, mega consolidation with mitigation. Right, Anna?
Nothing to add.
I'm just curious to clarify for this yellow column where the votes are sort of concentrating. Does that really mean don't charge net new square footage? If there's an addition, is that the lack of votes in that second column, is that meaning don't charge new development if there's an addition?
I think I'm going to answer that with a practical. It is also another area, like Rob said, where a very small addition that's going to make it work for something becomes cost prohibitive for small business. And there were multiple presenters over the years where I saw people come in and they were trying to put 200 square foot on something to make something work better for them so that all their staff aren't sitting on top of each other in an office. And it was, I mean, it just defies logic that we charge a small business who's trying to not particularly expand, but just make things work, charge. So I do think there's a logical piece that if you have a threshold of expanding it 10%, but then you get into the whole business of, well, who the hell's going to monitor all of that? But we definitely saw people coming in small, trying to make things work, add a little bit here, add a little bit there, already had employees, and they were being turned, they were being told that they would have to pay mitigation on extensions. And so I'm not a fan of small or relatable, scalable, obviously very different if you're, building a whole new office. But so that's where it just comes down to, unfortunately, policy doesn't help in practice a lot of what are the small things people are trying to do.
Excellent example on that one. So, Tyler, thoughts?
I agree with what everybody's saying. I think I would stay.
Sorry, Tyler, you cut out there. Can you just restate?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was saying I get what everybody's saying. I agree, especially going from a change. You took some old retail building to lodging. That's a pretty big change. I get that. I would still lean. I guess I would still keep my original vote of get rid of change of use for any of the existing buildings in town.
Let me ask Ashley. And then we're going to go to Melissa here to finish off here. And then we're going to ask Ashley and Wendy if we've got enough to at least give you direction, because we've got a few thoughts there. So go ahead, Melissa.
Well, clearly this is a pretty nuanced and complex question, so I've been going back and forth as I listen to what everyone has to say. I do think there's some threshold where we don't want the change of use to stifle small business or a reasonable expansion of an existing business. But it's also, you know, if it's a major change of use that's changing the workforce requirement, it does seem like there should be something in place. So I'm a little bit in between of get rid of change of use and the, what are you calling it, macro aggregate?
Macro aggregation, yeah. Ashley and Wendy, do you have enough and do you think to go on here, since that's probably the, you know, we've got in pretty good direction, but again, I think nuance was a good way to put
Yeah.
this.
No, so this is Wendy. No, I think I do. This has been a fantastic discussion, super helpful. I really appreciate it. I'll just offer a couple things based on what I heard. Number one, just recognize, you know, I can get more information on Telluride and Crested Butte. That being said, Telluride has had the same program in place since at least 2003, which was the first time that I helped them with their Nexus study and the work in their community. And so the fact that, especially since Telluride changes things a lot when it doesn't work right, the fact that it stayed the same kind of tells me that they're happy with it. So I'll just put it that way. The second one is on the last comment from Melissa, when there's a major change, you know, perhaps we need something in place to deal with that. Telluride does do that. If a building is demolished, so meets their definition of demolition, then they will, well, this gets more to their credits, but basically if a building is demolished, then in essence, it's considered a new use and a new build. And so they actually don't get credit for the existing building on the redevelopment. And so when it is a major change, they actually do get full mitigation at that time, FYI. So that's something we'll talk about in the next section.
Okay, so we are gonna keep moving and we're gonna do our best with the direction we have. It definitely, you know, sways to simplification though. This one, you know, I'm hoping we can move through these other ones fairly quickly in order to be on time here. You know, we can read these policies, but this is really, I think, and Ashley and Wendy and Jen can correct me if I'm wrong, really about credit is given for space that has not mitigated pre-1994 issue. Maybe Ashley, Wendy or Jen, do you want to jump in here and speak a little bit about this?
Yeah,
because that's one of the biggest issues.
Yeah, and I'm happy to talk about this. This is Wendy. So basically the main question is just, you know, are housing credits as they're currently given being properly allocated? And so what this is really referring to is, well, one, with change of use if it stays, and redevelopment, basically mitigation credit is given for the existing square footage. And so the example and the concern that was brought up to me from the town was basically that credit is given for space that never had to mitigate. So it was built prior to 1994, for example. In which case, does that make sense, was the question. An example given was, I think it was a hotel had torn down an old hotel that was built before 1994, never had to mitigate, but because they tore that down and then put up this brand new high service hotel, they really didn't have to mitigate any employees because they got full credit for the prior one, even though it was an older hotel and was definitely lower service. And so that was a concern that was raised. The other one was an example where, and again, this would only occur if change of use stays, the credit being tied to the building or space and not the business. And that gets to one of the examples that was brought up before. You know, if a lower intensive use moves into a higher intensive use, can you use those credits to someone else? What happened in this instance is it was the opposite. It was business that had actually built and mitigated in their current space. They moved to a less intensive use space across the street, or wanted to, and they could not take their mitigation with them. So basically they were being asked to mitigate for the same employees in the new space that they had already mitigated for in the prior space. So that was kind of the secondary issue.
Yep. Let's go right on this one. We're gonna go right to polling and then open it up for discussion. So on this one, so no change, so we stay with the current policy, which includes the pre-1994. Or credit only for space when you actually pay for mitigation. And so, any clarifying questions on this one? Because it seems simple on the surface, but it's a little tricky because you got to think back to the examples.
I did have a question, Bruce. Do either of these account for the example that was given where basically the business was being asked to mitigate for the same employees twice?
You know, this one
Right.
doesn't, but I think that can fall under other, and in part it didn't because it kind of the voting that happened in the prior one was what I was hoping would carry over to this one. So you know, the prior one was asking, do you want to retain change of use? It seemed from all the input that yes, if we can get rid of it, that would be great. In which case we would assume change of use goes away, and then that takes care of a lot of issues with the existing credit program that we would have to address. So technically, no, these selections do not include that. So I would say if we need to expand on that, that would come under other.
Thanks, Penny. And we lost Tyler for just a few minutes here, so he must not be going very far since he said he'll be back. Okay, and we're just missing one.
And I'll just talk while people are voting a little bit too. Both Aspen and Telluride. Telluride for demolition will provide credit. For demolition will not provide credit for space that was never required to mitigate. For redevelopment, they will. For Aspen, Aspen will not allow credit for demolition of space that was never required to mitigate. And for redevelopment, they are also slowly taking the ability to claim credit for space that never had to mitigate as well. Basically, they have a sliding scale that will max out in about 10 years.
So it sounds like on this one, you've added another factor in there as well. Wendy, that as people go around, it's whether it sounds like most people, for the most part, are going to be credit only when you for space that where you're required to mitigate. So if you mitigated, get credit for that. But when people go around, sounds like you threw in redevelopment, which was exempt from that. So we'll go around and see how we do here, and see if we can get clarity on the other, and then also the gray bar as well. So we get a skip. So we're going to start with Rob this time. Rob, thoughts on this one?
Well, I chose other under the circumstance. If not, no business should have to mitigate for its employees twice. Then that's the challenge where they run with the land.
Yep.
But I do feel it's appropriate if something was developed before 1994, never had to mitigate, having a credit for that I'd be open to that discussion that they don't get a credit for it because it was never in the supply line.
Okay, so you'd be open to saying goodbye to the 1994 exemption almost.
Yeah. I don't know how you'd administer a business moving that had to mitigate previously going into a space that's not mitigated. But if it's falling on the business owners and under Tyler's examples, that seems very unfair.
Gotcha.
I also don't want to give an incentive to, kind of borderline not tear stuff down or redo things if it needs to be redone. I know that can be a controversial statement, but it's expensive. If you have 10,000 square feet, you're going to tear it down, rebuild, and now it's 14, you're adding 4, but the mitigation on that 10,000 again might deter people from doing the project altogether. Maybe that's what people want, but I don't want too awful of buildings that are not getting torn down because of that.
All right, and then Tyler, can you speak to getting rid of the 1994? So in this case, there's an exemption for redevelopment. So some allowance for that, but what about prior to 1994 issue?
I guess I missed a couple minutes, but you're saying, those, since they did not mitigate, you're saying?
Right, you wouldn't get credit for it because they were, you can't get credit if you were, you can't take credit. You can't get credits if you were before 1994 because they never mitigated.
I get the argument. I kind of what I was saying is I worry about people, it deters people from any true redevelopment of a property because of that. Because like, hey, I'm using it, it's functional at what it is now. And then when you tear it down, that price per foot gets a little pretty high. I guess I'm in between. I get both sides.
Okay. Very good. Anna.
I don't have anything to add on that.
Okay. I'm assuming that means we sort of like where the discussion's sitting right now. But that's an assumption. Sky.
Not much to add. I agree with the, you shouldn't really get credit if it wasn't ever mitigated. And I like the idea of figuring out a way to credit businesses that are moving. But since all of this is about the physical space, not the business, it seems hard to do that.
Great summary. Rick.
Yes, so I was trying to be quick out of the gate, so I voted for 2 without hearing what Wendy had said, which certainly could cause a case for me to have voted for number 3 others. So that's my only feedback.
Okay, well, noted it's in the record here, so we'll make that adjustment. And Melissa, you get a closeout at the end, as always here. So
Just bring us back to the first comments and say I would agree with what Rob Delorier had to say.
very good. All right, we are going to keep moving because we have a couple of doozies here at the end. So we've got 2 more questions, one big one at the end. Does anyone have to leave directly at 5:30? So it would be meaning that we'd have to go about 10 minutes late, probably. Okay. Exemptions. So this is a great one. Current policies allows for exemption for smaller single-family units, which is quite common. In addition, public uses are exempt. So the main concern questions, and we'll be asking 2 of them quickly. Are we okay with the 2,500 exemption? And then the second question is, should public uses be exempt as we go forward? So I'm going to leave it that simple. We're going to go right to polling on this one so that we can get to a huge question at the end. And this one should be fairly simple to answer, but famous last words, right? So keep the policy the same, which exempts key institutional uses. So no change in the policy, and it exempts 2,500.
This is a de minimis exemption.
Right, allow, yep. or allow de minimis, if they put a workforce restriction on the home. Or reduce the size even further, less than 2,500. So, and this is only for, does not include institutional, so we're only talking about the de minimis exemption. So right now we've got, to make it smaller, if you want the exemption,
So this is for residential exemption.
correct.
If you build a house under 2,500 square feet, you don't need to pay an exemption
You do
or a
not.
fee.
You do not. So one person so far thinks that maybe that size should be reduced a little bit.
What's
And
it
that's
at
just
now?
in the county, correct?
Yes. Just in the county.
Reduce it from 2,500. The current policy says 2,500 and less is exempt.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I wasn't fast enough to read.
Yeah,
That's fine.
exactly. And this one,
Yeah.
while people are voting, I mean, I'll put Ashley and Wendy on the spot again. Is there a problem here for this one? We're not even talking about institutional, talking about size.
The
So-
side. The issue that was brought up here, that kind of the two sides that came out through discussions before this meeting is one, the 2,500 square foot exemption, the intent is to allow a local who wants to build a home to go ahead and do so without having to mitigate for a local house, a resident house in the community, which makes sense because they're building one. That being said, the flip side is that with the cost of land and the cost to build, the ability for a true local to actually build a 2,500 square foot home is pretty unrealistic in the county these days. There's going to be very few that can actually do that. And so the question arises, is the 2,500 square foot limit still appropriate? Should it be smaller? Are locals actually building less than that? And or is it appropriate, if they put a workforce deed restriction on it, okay, fine, you don't have to pay, but, we're just going to resign ourselves that everything in the county is going to be second home if you don't do that. Kind of the base.
Yeah, makes sense. Pretty straightforward. So most people are hovering around, 2,500 or less, you get an exemption, most likely for workforce or locals. With one being let's make it a little bit smaller, and we're going to hear from the other. And one person who's hasn't voted, so. Okay, let's put. Oh, was that you, Rob? You're gonna jump in?
Yeah, I have a question. I mean, the only place that I think locals are going to be able to afford to buy land and build, which I think is a very reasonable parameter to put around this, what can a local afford to build, is going to be some deed restricted parcel already, I would think. Right? Free market lot in Rafter J now is, I don't know how expensive they are. I think they're gone. What about the north-south park loop potential subdivision that'll have much smaller lots? I think you could go to 3,000 square feet. If somebody can do it, let them do it. They're working here. I don't think a second homeowner is going to build 3,000 square feet on a 0.17 acre lot. They're not even building that in East Jackson. They're building out 4,000 and 5,000 square foot homes. But I'll go with keep it the same. I would go smaller though.
All right, and then who was the other?
I was the other, and I have a hard time responding without understanding what the fee would be under the various scenarios.
Right, good point. Ashley, are you able to do that on the fly, or is that a tough ask?
I think we have this slide. Well, there's the mitigation requirement, and I gotta pull up the residential model here. So in the county, if someone were to build 100 units of housing would generate a need for Oh, I don't have this quite handy enough. Might have to go to the table in the presentation. It's towards the end. I don't have it quite handy enough on my. Oh, pass. Go back. Go back one more. Okay, here we go. So here's the single family. Oh shoot, we lost our labels of town and county. Town is in the middle. Single family is all the way over to the right. So if someone is building a single family unit in the county around 4,000 square feet, we'd be asking them to mitigate 0.39 of a unit. And then the fee levels, where did we put those in the presentation?
I believe they're at the end of the presentation.
Okay, so we can go
in the
see what
reference
that
slides.
would be. One more. Oh shoot, do we not have the fee level ones in here? Okay, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to go into a different presentation to grab the fee levels.
Might be able to do
I'm trying.
that as we go. So Melissa, we'll have to hopefully we can wrap back during the same session so we can conclude the thought, but it's not going
And
to be.
Bruce, I realize we're short on time, so that was why I clicked other rather than asking the question sooner. So if you want to hear from other people, that's quite all right.
Yeah, and you see where most people are leaning. Are you comfortable with it's leaning towards the no change in policy?
I am generally comfortable with that.
All right, very good. Let's go to the next one. Next one's pretty direct. And this one I believe we can get through, and then we can do a time check. Ryan, I'll be asking people whether they want to reconvene or whether we should push through. So I'd like you to weigh in on that, Ryan, after this question. So so on this one, it's whether public use should be exempted or not. And so a new in this case, Jen, remind me, is a school would be considered a public use?
Yes, education is part of the public uses.
So that's a good example. So recent area McCall, for Wendy's sake, has a school coming in and they're being asked to mitigate. Well,
And
that's
so,
all Idaho, so.
and I can provide just a little background of sort of where this came to. Basically, the discussion that came up was that in, institutional uses, public uses are currently exempt from having to do mitigation in the code. So that would include, town buildings, it would include the hospital, it would include the school district, et cetera. Issue being, okay, they're able to add space and they don't have to add units. However, most of those uses are. So, for the hospital has had a housing program in for 15, 20 years. The school district is working on developing some housing. The town has been building some housing for their employees. And so I guess the question is begged, the nice thing about allowing employers to do it on their own is they're able to actually build for their employees. So they understand what their employees need and they can build accordingly, and they don't have to necessarily comply specifically with, the town and the guidelines in the mitigation code. That being said, do they always build units? Possibly not. And the units that they build might come online, quite a time after they actually add square footage. So a question is timing, a question is, allowing them the flexibility to do it. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? The third thing is, well, they're commercial use, they should just comply like everyone else. So those are kind of the discussion points that I heard. I'm sure you guys have other concerns or statements or pros, cons.
All right, so for those who have not voted, what are we missing?
It's a broad category, public use then. It's not just like the county. The
Right.
hospitals are private business.
Mhm.
Schools can't take on debt, but they have a ton of land. They're trying to finance it.
And Rob, did you choose other or?
I haven't voted yet because I'm not sure. Again,
Right.
I think it's more nuanced a little bit. Public use seems like a broad category.
And Bruce,
go into
I'll
other.
interject. I selected others. So this is Rick with the Chamber of Commerce. Because I do believe that there's a hybrid that could work better than what we have now. Because I think when I think about the optics pieces, it's like, okay, is there a more equitable way that can be applied so that it doesn't feel like, for a better term, and I'm not saying this is necessarily the agreed upon comment, but this is what I hear, that one group is getting such unfair treatment than the other when everybody's just trying to exist. Yes, they should get a break, but is that break really nothing? So I guess that's the best way for me to put it.
All right, and Tyler, you didn't weigh in here yet, right?
No, I'm good with, I was the keep it as is. I'm good with it. I agree. It's a slippery slope, but I'm good keeping it and exempting them for schools and hospitals and all those things we need.
So nuanced and sort of, it's more complicated than that, and then here and just keep it the same, Melissa?
Obviously, I'm in other, and I think I would agree to some extent with what Rick said. Part of it is optics, part of it is, I think that was Wendy Tucking saying that a lot of these government agencies are providing housing anyway. And so I think, demonstrating that commitment in some way and giving them credit for that publicly is beneficial. I know, or I don't know, I might not have all my facts right. I do recall a recent housing generation study. And when I say recent, it was like in the last 5 to 8 years, showing how much housing has been generated by the public sector, or demand for housing has been generated by the public sector, this public use category that doesn't have any mitigation requirements. So I do think, especially in a community like ours, where we have a high number of government employees related to other uses, having some level of mitigation is appropriate, but I don't think that they should be mitigated at the same level as other commercial uses. We are in some ways paying for it 3 different ways. So, the higher mitigation levels just really, the public is footing the bill for that. So I don't have the answer of how that should be done, but I think that there should be some change.
Some change, but close to the same, for lack of better terms. Ashley and Wendy, does that give you, that, sort of the sense of the room?
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And I'll say the only example I found, I looked at about 7 different communities that have linkage programs. The only one I found that actually exempts institutional uses to any extent was Park City, and they have them mitigate at 50% of the rate. So that kind of gets to this middle ground that I guess Melissa and I think it was Rick talked about.
That's what we're hearing a lot of, is looks like that middle. So just a time check here, and I'm gonna look for Ryan for advice, knowing that we were gonna circle back and talk about mitigation levels, but this time in the light of units instead of fees. And then see if people are on the same as that summary that I gave initially, with retail being a little bit less, residential being a little bit more. So Ryan, on that one, do you want us to try to push through on this one, knowing that we only have it's a series of questions, but one topic left, or revisit it at a later date?
Because we're missing a handful of folks too that I think I'd like to hear from back on the mitigation. I don't want to lose their feedback on that. I almost want to circle back on that topic.
Is that okay with Melissa, Rob, Rick and Tyler, is it okay that we add one more meeting? We can use it as a summary of our direction, and then just revisit the last, the topic that we hit already, but in a different way. So I heard Rick, yes, and Melissa and Rob and Tyler, are you okay with that as well?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Maybe can we do it in a 1 hour meeting? That might be
That's
easier.
okay.
I know everybody's so busy and hard to schedule. I'll send out a doodle poll, but if we can do that in an hour, Bruce, if you think, that might make it easier.
Yeah, so 1 hour meeting, one topic, revisiting again mitigation levels as it relates to units, but it's a reconfirmation of philosophy. Are we still on the same page as when we talked about mitigation fees? And then little summary of where we're at, and maybe a little celebration too virtually. So and bring the baby.
You already had to hop
Alright.
off.
Well, look for a date. Do we want to try to settle that now, or you want to do that offline, right?
I'll do it because we don't have everybody here, so I'll do it via email.
All right. Well, I want to thank everyone. We're going to leave it at that point and say we're only 10 minutes late. But great discussion. Thank you for going through all those questions and all the work that you did. So
Thanks, everyone.
Really
Thanks,
thoughtful
guys.
feedback.
Talk
Thank
to
you.
soon.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks,
everyone.
all.
Bye.